All righty. Okay, well, good morning and happy Friday. Happy November 14, halfway through the month of November. Can't believe just around the corner we're in Thanksgiving. So I'm super excited of the holidays and time to spend some quality time with the family for sure. So today we're going to be talking about the ins and outs and working with flippers. Okay. Does everyone know what flippers? Okay. There used to be back in the 70s, there was a show called Flipper. It was about a dolphin. Okay. But that's not what we're talking about today. Flippers are individuals, and it's an acronym that is used highly in the investment world. Flippers are individuals that find ugly properties, turn around and get them renovated and ultimately put them back on the market for a profit. Okay. Those are what we call flippers. These are individuals that rely in our expertise to find, identify, negotiate, submit, open escrow, and ultimately close the deal with the intent that as soon as the property gets officially recorded, and they become the owners of the property. They start what we call the renovations, right? The demo and the process to get the property from being ugly to getting it nice and pretty and back on the market. Now, where do we come in as real estate agents with this, right? You need to start building a book of business and really start. And I'm pretty sure all of you get text messages consistently with something that says, "Hey, we're ready to buy. Hey, do you have any fixed properties or any ugly properties that you have available?" So it just seems like there's a stream of investors out there that are looking for opportunities. So the beautiful thing as real estate agents is you got the golden ticket. If you can find a good property for the flipper to ultimately get, right? And it's based on many factors, right? One of those factors is obviously what they can buy the property for, what it's going to cost, and then ultimately what we call what they can sell the property at the end, right? What we call the after repair value. And I know last week we were talking a little bit in how to work and navigate, but today it's more the understanding of working specifically with flippers and really arming yourself in knowing how to negotiate terms as well, because flippers have a different way of looking at things, right? They typically don't have emotions involved when it comes to properties. They look at numbers. If the numbers make sense, then ultimately they're going to want this property, right? If the numbers do not make sense, then they'll probably not want to buy the property. Now, it all depends also on the margins because I can talk to three different flippers, right? Or three different investors. They're all going to have a different opinion and views of the property, right? Your job is just to introduce these opportunities to these investors or to yourself as well. That's the beautiful thing of properties, that if you find a great property that makes sense, why can't you buy it as part of the initial process? Now, it's all calculations too, as well, right? It's not just necessarily finding an ugly house, because if the property is not at the right price, then it wouldn't make any sense, regardless in the condition, right? Because in essence, when when an investor is looking at properties, right, they look at location as well. Okay, location, right? One of those is, is it near a great school, right? Is it in a great community, right? All of those will factor in if it's a good property to ultimately invest, right? Because people will pay premium for a home when it's in move-in condition, right? They'll pay top dollars if they have all of the upgrades, right? More so amenities, right? Maybe this property never had an air condition, right? And now, as part of the investment in flipping the property, you include an HVAC, right? That has AC and heater, right? That may be a benefit to the end consumer that's willing to pay top dollars. That's the whole purpose and margins that investors are looking for is what can they make as a spread and profitability after all expenses. So from an agent's view and perspective, you have to start and have that same kind of parameter and had in place, right? You got to think like an investor, right? Not just as a real estate agent, but more as an investor too. What is that the investors are looking? What are the investors wanting, right? And at the end, if they can get a property that is is something that they can make a decent amount of profit, right? Because all investors have their own criteria, right, of what they consider profit. Some may say, "I'm good with 50,000 profit after all expenses." Others say, no, I have to make a minimum threshold of $100,000. Some would say I need to make at least 150,000 or even more, depending on the geographical area, right? Where you end up finding these investment portfolios, right? And then you look at, is it renovation? Is it a tear down? Is it where they're doing new construction? Is it land? Because remember, flippers also look at it from two different perspectives, right? One perspective is, a house that's in really bad condition, we make it now nice and beautiful, right? Where others may see it as this is a tear down, like let's say Manhattan Beach as an example. You can, build beautiful new construction there with very small lots. I've seen lots in the 3,000 to 4,000, and they build these tri-level, houses there that now are selling for 3 to even $4 million, right? So it really depends on the scope and who you're working with, because most investors and flippers are in it for the quick in and out, right? What we call the down and dirty, right? Where they just want to go in there, renovate it, and then ultimately put the property back on the market and then sell it for a profit, right? But the essence is when having conversation is ask the question, well, what is it the margins that you're looking for, right? Because they and you have to be in the same page, right? Are they realistic? Because if they think they're going to make, hundreds of thousands of dollars, but they're looking at an area that doesn't give you those margins, then you don't have a very realistic investor or flipper, right? So in looking at the scope of everything, right, and you working with investors, sit with them and get a concise understanding of what that is, because most investors are looking to make a certain amount of profit, right? And it may be $50,000 that they're okay, but if they're doing consistent deals, right? Think about it for a quick minute. If they do 10 deals a year at 50,000, that's not a bad return on your investment, right? Because you're going in there, doing the renovations, typically they're looking at anywhere 90 to 4 to maybe even 6 months, depending on the severity and the project itself. Now, the other component as a real estate agent that you have to understand is, when asking questions is, do you have a solid team? Do you have good contractors, good subcontractors? Do you have good handyman? Do you have an architect? What type of financing are we looking? Is it in all cash? Is it hard money? Are you using some type of financing, right, when it comes to it? Because that's going to give you the answer on how you're going to be able to maneuver this. Because remember, most listings that are on the market, that properties that are in really bad condition, right? They're going to want very stringent conditions, right? Meaning they're not going to give you your traditional 30 days of escrow, right? They're not going to give you your 17 days to release contingencies, right? The original TV show Flipper, yeah, thank you very much, Robert. You're always so spot on. But typically, your investors are looking for components that make sense to them, right? Either to go in and go ahead and purchase, but the conditions, right? And this is why you need to prepare yourself when arming yourself when it comes to negotiations, because remember, you're not just the only one that is in competition. You may have other buyers too that want the same property, right? So how do you make your property or excuse me, your offer stand out, right? Well, it all is based on the purchase agreement and how you navigate it, right? One of the elements that you also should consider is, for the sake of understanding, is this a corporation or is this an individual, right? Most investors use what is called a LLC, right? A limited liability company, right? And the reason is because it's just easier to get funding, more so for like hard money lending. Most investors use LLCs in order to purchase because it separates their personal from their business entity, right? And when working with flippers, they typically have LLCs that they use for that purpose. And most individuals will create it as we're in the initial process. They'll start with one LLC, but then they create a new entity or a new LLC for each and every different type of property that they buy, especially if this investor is buying, 2 to 3 deals every month, right? And when you get to that level of purchasing properties, you need to have a very systematic approach in how you position yourself when it comes to these offers that you're making, right? And the beautiful thing is that it separates each and every property because you don't want to put all of your LLCs in one, excuse me, you don't want to put all of your properties in one LLC, right? Because of the sake of liability and lawsuits, right? Because now they can tag all of the investment portfolios you have. Most investors that are very savvy and understand the elements use different LLCs, meaning for one property, let's just say that it's 100 or 1642 259th place, right? As an example, they're going to probably use that as part of the LLC, right? They'll usually use the address and then follow with the LLC. And that's a typical thing that we see quite often. Now, let's talk about your position when it comes to navigating those conversations, is asking the right questions, right? At the end of the day, are they going to be tire kickers, individuals that don't have the experience and think and want to be flippers, or are these sophisticated individuals that are not going to waste each other's time and are willing to pull the trigger and ultimately go to the finish line, right? Because we don't want to be in a situation where you're in escrow and then the buyer gets cold feet, right? Because now they realize, oh my goodness, I've overpaid for the property. The project now is going to be more than what I anticipated, right? This is why you want to arm and position yourself when having conversations with investors, is to ask again the right questions, right? When you're sitting down with them, again, going back to what I was saying is, do you have your contractors in place? Because the minute that you submit offers, right, and your offer gets accepted, you should be on the forefront. And ultimately, my suggestion, and this is again my suggestion, is your contractor, meaning your client's contractor, should be going there when you're showing the property for the first time. That tells you that they're serious, right? When the contractor goes in there, they can give a ballpark estimate when it comes to, what needs to be done to the property in order to make it, nice and pretty or in move-in condition, right? And most contractors have two elements, right? You have contractors that do remodels, and then you have contractors that understand the elements and component of flipping property. Okay, because there's contractors that do not do flips. They're contractors, they do great job, but they're not flippers, meaning they don't work with flippers, meaning individual investors that buy property. And the reason I say this is because someone that is going to renovate it, they want something as of urgency, like a 911. They want things done quickly and efficiently in a timely manner. And ultimately, they want things done like yesterday, right? So there's a lot of contractors that unfortunately they're spread so thin because they have multiple projects going on with different individuals. They may not have the time. So these are, again, questions that you need to ask. Is your team ready to come in? What's the expectancy of time, right? That most of your contractors typically take when it comes to a property that you inquire, right? Any good investor will have those answers immediately, right? The goal for the investor is to be in and out immediately, right? Is, what's the time frame? Well, depending on the severity of the project, sometimes it's just cosmetic. Okay. But sometimes it's really more internal where we have to gut the entire house, right? From drywall all the way down to the studs, right? Because plumbing, electrical has to be redone, floors have to be redone, kitchen, bathrooms, right? Roof. Okay. All of those you have to take into consideration is because that all takes time, and time is obviously money for the investor. So they look at all of the components when they assessed what type of offer to make, right? Because, when they're doing their numbers, they're really looking at, okay, when am I going to be able to sell this? Because I want to sell this immediately. I don't want this property to be sitting on the market for a very, very long time. I want this as soon as it hits the market within 2 weeks. I want to be in escrow already closing this deal, within the next 30 days, because the longer a property is not being done, the more money they lose, especially flippers and investors that are using hard money loans, right? Because there's holding costs, there's front expenses, there's expenses during the project renovations, and then there's also expenses as we close the deal, right? So all of that takes into consideration of what profit they're going to make, right? So as real estate agents, we have to understand all of those components. And, until you actually get involved with working with an investor, then you'll understand how they run, you know and you're that golden ticket at the end of the day, because if you have a property that hits all the bells and whistles in a very nice community that is really up there in value, you're going to be, someone that they want to be working with you, right? So how do you get in that position? Well, it's lead gen at the end of the day, right? From the time you're driving, right? Are you looking as you're driving? Are you not just paying attention to the to your driving, but are you also looking at the neighborhood and looking at neighborhoods that, are desirable neighborhoods that people want to live? And on that neighborhood, there's sometimes homes that are in really bad condition, right? Those are the ones that you want to, have a opportunity to stop, write down the address, do a little bit of research, because if you see 50 houses that are really nice, the landscaping, they just pride of ownership, and then you come across a house that the grass is as tall as you, right? The roof is in really bad condition. There's no, it looks like it hasn't been painted for years, right? All of that gives you an idea. Well, you know what? Maybe I should just see if they're motivated to sell, right? It doesn't hurt. As real estate agents, we should be on the forefront of at least door knocking, introducing yourself, and seeing if you can get an opportunity to find out if they're motivated enough to sell. Because guess what? Investors will buy the property in its as is condition, right? In with very favorable terms, because they want that property immediately so they can secure it, close it, and then get their crew out there to start doing the renovation. So, again, just kind of giving you a base to really understand when working with investors the importance is, because not all properties that you throw at an investor is good, right? And again, this is why you want to sit down with them and ask them, well, what do you want to make as a profit, right? That's the first thing you should be having a conversation is, where are you with profit, right? Well, I'm okay to make 50,000. I'm okay to make $75,000. Okay. then you at least know where you stand with that. Because if someone says, I want to make $300,000, well, that's more of a new construction, right? That's a tear down that you're going to just completely do everything. One other thing that I also want to mention to all of you as well is the importance of, securing the opportunity on the back end, right? What happens on the back end when you want to have the opportunity? You gave this individual investor an opportunity to secure this property because you identified, you found them, you were able to negotiate and get the property in contract. But you're also looking at the back end of the situation as I would love for this investor that I gave the opportunity to buy, for this individual to give me the opportunity now to list the property. How do you secure that? Well, it's all conversations, right? So let's just say, for example, I'm having a conversation and tell me a little bit of your history. How many properties have you bought in the last 12 months? If they say they have never bought any properties or they haven't bought anything in the last 12 months, then that makes you think a little bit, are they really sophisticated investors? Do they know? Because, not all properties are good deals, right? And more so, you don't want this individual that wants to pretend that they know what they're doing because they've been trained on these so-called investor clubs, right? That may jeopardize the whole situation. And now they're pulling out of a transaction is because they just don't feel confident enough, right? So you as real estate agents need to also have those conversations to feel compelled that you're working with someone that knows the process and is not going to waste each other's time. Because there's a lot of people out there that are just, again, as I mentioned, they're just tire kickers. They believe, but they're not willing to go. And now you're just giving your time showing properties that they're not committed, right? So you need to have a commitment. Now, when it comes to structuring offers, right? This is where the rubber meets the road, right? You have to understand and have those conversations with the investors as look, in order for your deal to look very enticing and very promising. Remember, you either have to go all in with a cash offer and eliminate loan and appraisal contingency, because you're buying a property way below market value, right? Um, so that's an automatic, right? Now, I've heard it many, many times, and this is where it distinguishes a true investor from a not true professional, is someone that is going hard money, right? And they still want to hold on to their appraisal contingency, right? Well, on the back end, the listing agent is just going to say, well, listen, you know what? That's part of the stipulation is if they're holding on to an appraisal contingency on a property that needs a lot of work and they're buying it below market value because they're getting a hard money loan. Now, hard money doesn't necessarily mean all cash. It just means private funding, private means, right? There's still a qualification when it comes to hard money. So you have to know and understand that when you talk to investors and they say all cash, we're going to say all cash. Ask that question. Okay, is it all cash where you have the proof of funds in your bank account? Or are we using private funds such as a hard money loan in order to qualify, which you can treat it like a cash deal because you're removing the loan, but it's not considered cash. So you got to know the distinguishes between hard money loan and cash. If the individual has 100,000, excuse me, $1 million in their bank account and they're buying a property for 500,000, you know that they have the cash in order for them to buy this property, then yes, it is considered a cash deal. But if they tell you, no, I only have $250,000 in my bank account, we're going to put as a cash offer, but it is traditional or hard money loan. Well, hard money loans, you still got to go through the venti process, right, of getting approved. And there's a certain threshold or down payment that you have to put in order for them to allow the funds to go through. Now, the beautiful thing about hard money loan, it's not based on the investor's qualifications. Okay, it's not like your traditional mortgages, right? They don't typically ask for much. What the how they utilize the qualification process is based on the condition of the property, right? What you buy the property for and what the after repair value. That's how they qualify the property. And then ultimately they ask, well, what is the amount that you're going to need in order to renovate this property? Is it 100,000? Is it 200,000? 300,000. Now, with the price that you're buying the property and the cost to renovate it, is there still enough room to be able to sell it? Because the risk from a hard money loan is if this individual defaults and doesn't make at least the minimum mortgage payment, and we start the initial notice of default and then foreclose, can they still get this asset and then sell it to another investor that can complete the deal and still get their money out? So this is why they calculate and really make sure that the numbers make sense before they just lend on hard money loans. So even hard money lenders out there, they are doing their due diligence as well and also doing their numbers to make sense. They're not just going to write a check and put the money into escrow without, knowing the risk factors as well. So, but that goes back again because even hard money lenders, they want to know that this individual has experience, right? Provide us with a resume of all of the deals that you've closed, right? Again, going back to your position as a real estate agent, because this is very, very important and how you navigate this, because again, I don't want you to waste time. I don't want you to be in the middle of a transaction and the deal falls apart because this individual just doesn't understand the elements. And there's always going to be risk when it comes to flippers and buying property, right? If they don't know, what's going to happen is halfway through the project, they're going to run out of money. And now they don't have the means to sell the property in a move-in condition. And that's going to be an issue or in a problem, right? Because they're not going to have enough money and profit to pay you on the back end when it comes to the listing as well. So remember all of this when having conversations with flippers, right? And it all really stems is from the beginning, right? Because the way investors look is, can I make money and profit in the front end, right? That's the first indicator is, okay, if I secure this property, I'm going to make some profit on it, from the minute it closes, right? Because now they see the long picture, and 6 months from now, when it's completely renovated and they sell the property for more than what was bought for, that's your spread, right? After all expenses. So part of the initial process is asking the right questions again, right? When you're looking at property and you identify a property that makes sense, and I get a lot of people sending me a lot of projects. 90% to 95% of the properties that are sent my way, I pass because I already know that the numbers won't make any sense to me, or it may be too tight on profit. Because remember, there's so many delays and so many dilemmas that can happen, right? Just because we know what the property's worth doesn't mean that's going to be worth in 6 months. What if the market tanks? What if rates come up even more, right? What if this particular area changes, right? In value. All of that you have to take into consideration. But again, at the end of the day, folks, it's all risk also, right? Because you're taking a risk that the end goal after you complete it, that there's going to be a margin of profitability, right? So the question here is when navigating the purchase agreement is, the first is the price, okay? The listing has it at this price and it's been on the market just 2 or 3 days. Are you going to submit an offer less than what the listing prices, or you're going to ask questions? Okay, the answer is very simple. You're going to call the listing agent and you're going to ask questions. One, do you have any other offers, right? Especially on a property that's way below market value because they want to get urgency and offers. You're probably going to be in competition. So one of the things that I would ask, what is it going to take for our offer to be considered? That's a very legitimate and a straightforward conversation I would have with the listing agent. And I'll say, what is it going to take to get this offer done, right? Well, the listing agent is either going to do one or two things, right? Listing agent is going to say, well, you need to, at least come up more, right? Or give us your best offer. Maybe they're just going to be very neutral in that conversation and not spill the beans and tell you. They're going to say, just bring your best with the best terms, right? And so then you need to know how to position yourself, right? When it comes to this. One, urgency, right? Urgency is one of the biggest thing in investments. Is how fast can this buyer close the deal, right? So after you complete all of the information here and got the information of the listing agreement, this is the most important elements of your position is the price terms, right? What can you close this out, right? Is it going to be 30 days, 45 days, right? Most investors can probably close in 10 days, 15 days to 10 days. A really good investor can do this, right? And some can do it faster, especially if it's all cash, right? Because they're going to tear it down. They're going to start from scratch. They can care less of the house, right? And the only thing that is holding and why you want to have at least enough time, which is anywhere from 7 to 12 to 15 days, is because you want to do your due diligence, right? One. And then two, you want to make sure that title is clear, right? That there is no issues when doing the transfer of ownership, right? We don't want to have any issues that now comes back and haunts your buyer. This is why you want to give escrow and title the time necessary for them to not make any mistakes and errors. This is why, you want to, give that buffer, right? But I've seen real estate deals close in 7 to 8 days in 1 week. I've seen deals happen, right? Because they're really tearing it down. As soon as we close, they got bulldozers and construction crew, and they start eliminating it. Many, many years ago, back in the early 2000s, I had a listing in the city of Whittier. And what I didn't know and what the buyer did not disclose was I represented the seller, and they had a property, single family residence, with a 15,000 square lot property. So huge property lot. It had a swimming pool with a cabana. So beautiful, beautiful home. It was passed on from the parents. So my sellers, who was the wife, that used to be her childhood home when her parents were still alive, and they've had that property for decades. So when the parents passed away, they held onto the property for another 10 years before they decided to sell the property. Okay. And when they decided to sell the property, they reached out. I listed the property, and they kept telling me and warning me of this individual that has been scoping this property and has ultimately tried to reach out to the owners about selling the property. But they were adamant about this individual because he was an investor. And they told me, please make sure that you don't sell it to this investor. We want this property to go to a family instead of this investor, right? And the reason they didn't want this investor to buy the property was because he owned the property to the right. He owned the three properties on the opposite side of the street, and he wanted to do all new construction. And what he needed was our lot, right? Our lot to be able to do the construction to build. I think it was 8 new construction homes, and was going to tear it down. So the investor that originally reached out to them, he spilled the beans and told this to my clients, and he thought that was a good thing because he was improving the community. But remember, my client at the time, this was her child home. So there was emotional attachment that's not what she wanted. She wanted to also provide that to a new family with children and her experiences growing up in this home, the summers and the swimming pool and all that. So when they told me, we do not want to sell this property to this individual, I got it. I understand. I can't control, I can't stop anyone from submitting offers, but it doesn't mean that you have to accept any offer that comes your way. Well, as soon as I put the property on the market, I immediately got a call from this individual contractor. Okay. And he says, "Hey, I have someone that's interested in buying the property." I says, "Wonderful. Um, may I take a look at the home?" It says, "Absolutely. I was going to host an open house. Look, better yet, why don't you come on Saturday?" So he came on Saturday and I met this individual. I don't remember his name, but he says, "Hey, I'm John Smith." And I was the individual that called. I says, "Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming in." So what was interesting and was odd at the same time was that he came with the tape measure. And he started going in there and measuring the house, which is interesting, right? Because someone that comes and sees the property, they come and just look at the property, but he was there for a good hour doing measurements, like if it was his property already. And I didn't put two and two together. Why was this in the back of my mind? Because I was in questioning, it was vacant, and I had a lot of people coming in and seeing this property. But it was just a little odd that he was there. And he was there for about an hour doing measurements. And didn't think anything of it. I did mention it to my clients. Hey, I says, "Hey, I have a motivated individual who's a contractor." And they asked, "What's his name?" And I told him his name at the time. He goes, "Okay, that's not the individual that we're worried about." I says, "Okay." So the following day, which I did another open house, the same guy came back and went back and started doing additional stuff to the property, measuring and all that. I says, "You must be a very interested party here that you want this." "Yeah, we want this property." Very straightforward, very matter of fact. "Yeah, we want this property." No emotions, just straightforward. He says, "Well, are you going to be the one submitting an offer?" He goes, "No, it's my client." I says, "Your client interested? Okay, who's your client?" "Well, my client is someone that owns an insurance company out in I think it was in Santa Fe Springs." I asked, the individual's name, and he says, "So and so." I said, "So and so." Okay. So again, I reached out to my clients and I provided that information, and they said, "Nope, that's not the individual that has been reaching out to us years prior wanting this property." Because they told me the individual's name, right? Well, ultimately that Monday, that same contractor reaches out to me and says, "Hey, we want to make an offer." I says, "Fantastic. Are you working with a real estate agent?" "No, we want you to represent." Okay. Now I had a listing, and back then we were able to really share the commission, right? Because we used to have where you can cooperate with any brokerage. So I had a 6% listing. Okay, 3% to the listing side and 3% to the buy side. That was the common practice, right? Now it's a total different parameter in place. So I was excited. God, just put it on the market over the weekend, and Monday I already got an offer. And we had a lot of interest on the property, but nothing solid. But this individual reached out, says, "Yeah, we want to submit an offer, and we're very interested." So I says, "Fantastic. Who do I need to speak with?" Right? "Well, you're gonna make an offer based on this corporation, so the corporation is buying it." I says, "Okay, tell me a little bit more of the intent." "Well, we're just going to renovate the property. Okay, we're going to renovate it and ultimately rent it out." Okay, I says, "Fantastic." And I said, "Well, are you gonna rent it out? what's the plan? He goes, yeah, we're going to rent it out as part of the investor's portfolio is just do cosmetic work and then ultimately put the sign for rent and get a tenant involved, right? So I provided all that information, right, to my clients, and they were okay. We really wanted to sell it to a family. I says, yeah, but we don't have any offers. We can hold on to this and see if we get anything over the week, or maybe we can do another open house, right? Um, the following weekend, right? And it says, look, we just want out of this. Let's just go ahead and accept this offer. They're asking very limited conditions. They know that the property is being sold in as is. They're offering full asking on it. Let's go ahead and open escrow. So I said, fantastic, let's do this. So open escrow, and it was a quick, I think it was like 20-day escrow or sooner. And once I got all of the information, I ended up meeting with the owner of a insurance company and needed to have him sign all of the paperwork to get the ball rolling, right? And again, didn't put two and two together. Well, the corporation that ended up buying it was a new structure corporation. They ended up getting it all signed and executed. I presented to the sellers. Sellers accept. We open escrow, and we were on track. No issues whatsoever. But what was interesting is that this contractor was coming there almost every other day. And again, not that is anything wrong. They're going through their due diligence, right? It just was a little strange that he was there consistently. And again, not that there was anything wrong with that, right? Because the home was vacant. But it was just a little interesting that the individual was going every other day and doing what they need to do, their due diligence, and then measuring and everything. So finally, the deal goes as planned. The deal closes, and I uh, let the clients know, my sellers, congratulations. Remember, I was representing both parties on this, right? So both parties were my clients, right? So I congratulated both, and I thanked them for the opportunity. And then once the official recording, which I remember very dear to me because it was a total shock to me, um, was the minute that we recorded, and we recorded it early, right? It was around 11 o'clock. They could care less of the keys, right? They didn't care about the keys. I had a lockbox, but what was so interesting about the situation was that same a day when we knew it officially transfer ownership, I just happened to go and pull my lockbox because I was going to get the keys to give to the buyer. We already had construction happening. And there was a commercial water pump literally took all of the water from the pool. And there was major construction all that afternoon. I got there kind of late afternoon, to go get the lockbox and all that. And I was like taken back. Half of the pool had already been removed, and half of the house was already being tear down.
Wow.
And I realized that's not what you guys told us. You told us you were going to do minor renovations to rent this property. Well, they've decided to go in a different trajectory. So I immediately called my sellers and I said to the sellers, hey, just to let you know, they're tearing down the property. And they said, what? So they immediately go out there and realize, holy moly, yeah, it's happening. So the sellers were taken back. They were very upset about the situation. And not myself nor the sellers had no indicators, right? We thought we were selling it to someone that was actually just going to do minor cosmetic work to the property and rent the property out. And we found out that it was the individual that ultimately was years back wanting to buy this property because he needed that lot to be able to get the permits necessary for him to do the construction to build 8 new homes on a cul-de-sac. But because the property, and I can share with you what I meant, I'll use the chalkboard here just as illustration. Okay. So I listed this property here. Okay, I hope people on Zoom, you can see this real quick.
Yes.
Okay. I listed this property, which was 15,000 lot. There was a fence right here, right, that separated both lots. That owner owned this property. He owned the property behind on the other side of the street. He owned that property. And then he owned this property back here too. Okay. He did not own the property that was here, but he owned the property that was back here as well. Okay. He needed our property. Now, the swimming pool was here, the house was here. When I went that afternoon, there was a water pump down the drainage pumping out the water, but there was already half of it was already completely demolished. And then half of the house was already being ripped apart. But the issue here was he was not able to do the 8 new constructions because he needed this property, because he needed the land here, because we had a long driveway and then the garage was here, the pool was there, and then the house separated from the pool. But he needed this because this was going to be now the main line, right? And I'll show you what I mean. So as I mentioned, this is the divider, right, of this house and this house. But they were going to build a cul-de-sac, okay, where now they were going to build 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 homes. And now this was the street. This was the street. So this was the main street. And they needed this to be able to do all of these new. So he needed our property, which was the biggest lot of 15,000 square feet, to be able to utilize, so the city would give them the permits in order to tear down that house, that house, that house, and obviously our house. So talk about a win for the investor, right? Because he already owned these individual properties and they were all tenant occupied. Okay. But eventually he tore down the whole entire parcels and started new construction. Darn it, I wish I would have known, because I wanted to list all these 8 new properties, right? But by that time, they had already a bad taste. Well, the sellers had had a bad taste, and they didn't blame me, right? They did not blame me on this situation because this was out of my hand. I had no idea. One, I didn't know who the individual was. I never saw him. They never saw the individual. Everything was over the phone, and everything was letters sent to their primary home, which they lived like 4 or 5 cities on the other side of the hill. But the essence he would have not been able to do so, because imagine if I would have sold this property to a homeowner, right? Then he would not be able to do any of this stuff, because that's the intent. And he's been trying for years and years and years to have the seller sell it directly to the investor. The moral of the story is, you got to be very careful, right, when working with individuals, because you just don't know their intent. We don't know. And to me, it was an eye opener, because one is, the sellers wanted to sell the property to a family. But at the end, when they got this offer, they had a change of heart. They were getting what they wanted, and it wasn't the individual, apparently wasn't the individual that they thought it was. So there was some type of decoy that ultimately they worked it in a way. They didn't pursue it. I mean, they didn't really have any recourse to pursue it, because they signed the agreement to sell the property, right? But at the end, yeah, that was not what they wanted. They really wanted to sell it to a family. And it was unfortunate, but it also put things in perspective for me. And it made me really think of, you know, are you asking enough questions? What am I missing? Why was this person so adamant about constantly coming to the property? I didn't put the pieces together, right? That should have been an indicator right there, right? And I could have possibly done things a little different. I don't know. I think back, I can go back in time and try to fix it. But imagine if I did my due diligence and really had the conversation, is like, I don't know, just something doesn't feel right about these particular buyers. Maybe we should wait and see if we can find another buyer, right? And host an open house for the following weekend. That house would have probably still be there to this day. And not that this investor did a bad job. There were beautiful, there were like two-story single family homes. But out of the four houses, that three of them he owned and eventually owned the listing that I had, he was able to create 8 new constructions out of it. And they were selling at the time, I can't remember, because I remember selling our property for like 475,000. And again, this was early 2000, 1999. And I remember this because this is one of my war stories, of many war stories that I've been involved in real estate transaction, that most of us will eventually will remember the ones that have been challenging, or the ones that have been very rewarding, right? Because all of us, when you do a lot of real estate transaction, you're going to come across ones that were like wonderful, great working with these individuals, right? And especially real estate investors, right? Because that can be a golden ticket to opportunities, working with investors, because they are systematic. They are looking for properties. They cut to the chase. They eliminate the red tape. They just want great properties that you can service. And it can be like a conveyor belt, right? Because if you have 5 investors, right, that you're working with, they can keep you pretty busy, really busy throughout the year, because you're looking at it from a front end of the offer submission and acceptance to now the back end, and ultimately getting the listing. Now, what I wanted to share with you, because I didn't want to really go into the purchase agreement, but really it's just the contingencies, right? Because it's going to be based on price and then what type of finance involved. Okay. And if it's hard money finance, then you can just put here other, and then just put hard money loan here, right? If you're doing hard money, right? You don't want to say all cash, okay? Because hard money is not considered all cash. And if you're working with a listing agent that is very experienced, right? And you go cash and don't tell them that it's really hard money, that may be a problem. Now, shame on the listing agent too for not asking a lot of questions, is because I would be asking, is it all cash? It's all cash. Okay, well, let me see the proof of funds. Okay, I want to see that the individual has the means. And if I see that it's less than the amount they're submitting offer, then that's an alert. Okay. They're probably going hard money. Then that's when I would ask, listen, I don't see the $1 million in your bank account to be able to buy this, $600,000 property.
Jaime,
Okay. Yes.
I'm sorry, what is hard money again?
Hard money loans is kind of private money.
Okay,
It's investors that pool their money together, lend money to investors to be able to buy properties to renovate and fix.
thank you.
Yeah. I would also suggest Google hard money loans, and it'll give you all of the information on what hard money loans are. Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. So in essence, you're going to put that if it's a hard money loan, even though you're releasing, the loan contingency, which is perfectly fine because you don't need a loan contingency because it eliminates the red tape, but you want to be very transparent in your position, and you want to make sure that it is hard money, not necessarily cash. Because if you go with cash, that's kind of a little bit of a breach. At the end, if they can close, it doesn't matter. I would not delay or make it any difficult, because if they say they can close in 10 days and they didn't honestly tell you that it was hard money, you can write it and in the hopes that they close. And if they don't close on time, then you send them the demand to close and then cancel on them. And I'm hoping by that time that the buyer has released any and all contingencies, because you don't want to be nice to these individuals, right? They're really sophisticated. The seller may have recourses and ultimately go after the buyer's earnest deposit, right? The ones that you have to be a little bit more lenient and more caring are your first-time home buyers or homeowners, or excuse me, buyers that want it as a home to live, right? But investors, I would expect that you can have a little bit more of a granular approach and more an aggressive approach as well. That shame on them, that's they should know what they're doing. And if they forfeit their deposit, they know exactly that the reason behind, they didn't perform, right? So you don't have to be as lenient to investors and flippers as you would to first-time home buyers, right? Now, how do you secure, right? So now that you have this, the last part of it, and then I'll give you the strategy and how you can secure a listing, okay, even though the buyer doesn't have possession of the property, they're not the owners. I can show you a way that you can ultimately secure that opportunity on the front end. So that way, you close the deals and then they change of heart or change of mind. They say, by the way, we're not going to give you the listing after all, right? Because that can happen. There's no guarantee. It's not like you can have them sign a listing agreement, right? It's not like you say, I want you to sign a listing agreement immediately. I'm not the owner. Okay. I'm not the owner. And they can challenge that, because I've seen agents have them sign a listing agreement for 1 year. And then the investor says, well, this is invalid. It's void. I was not the owner. Here's the proof. I didn't become the owner 10 days, 15 days after I closed on this. I signed this prior, so I didn't have a valid agreement. And that's their argument. And guess what? They're going to win, because you don't have a legitimate listing agreement. How do you protect yourself on those opportunities, right? Because if you give a buyer, an investor, a good property, it doesn't hurt to ask on the back end that, hey, I found you this property. At least give me the opportunity to list the property, right? Because then you'll get commission on the purchase, but you also get commission on the listing aspect of it, right? A win-win, right? I would say that an investor should give you at least the opportunity. Again, having the conversation in the forefront is crucial. Have the conversation from the very beginning, right? So then the other is obviously the contingencies, right? The contingencies are going to be vital and crucial, right? Because most listing agents are not going to give you 17 days. If you're closing in 10 days, why would they give you 17 days? They're going to condense it to maybe 5 days, right? So having very strong terms will get your offer accepted too when you're working with investors, and explain to the investor, look, you want this offer accepted, you want this property, then we got to go in strong. And you're going to have to be willing to um, sacrifice or maybe forfeit your deposit. Okay, then what you can do is go with a less deposit. Instead of going a traditional 3%, ask the investor, how much money are you willing to lose? Well, what do you mean? Well, look, if you can't perform, I don't want to waste the seller's time and more so the listing agent. I need you to know that if you can perform or not. If you're telling me you can close in 10, 15 days and you don't, there has to be consequences, right? Yes, my job is to protect you, but also I need to know if you're a serious investor too, because I don't want to waste each other's time, right? So we got to eliminate and reduce the contingencies, which is part two of the grid, right? That's how you're going to get your offer accepted, is based on, loan appraisal, sellers can disclosures, physical inspections, insurance, review of preliminary title report, all of the above, right? So if you can eliminate or reduce it, then you're in a good position. Obviously, the price, right? Prices will ultimately will give you an upper advantage, but also an investor is looking at how much can they get the property that they could still make money on the back end, right? So by reducing your contingency periods will also help. All right, so let me just touch on how you can secure, okay, a listing when your client still doesn't own the property. Does everyone know how to get that? Okay, how to get a listing when they don't even own the property, okay? So the way you do it is with all of the changes that have transpired, right? Have transpired last year, where buyers now have to sign BRBCs. Okay. What you're going to do is on the BRBC, the buyer representation agreement. Okay. And this is for your investors. Okay. When working with investors, you're going to have them sign a buyer representation agreement, right? And you're going to have the conversation with the investor, and you're going to say, look, if you secure this property and we open escrow, one, congratulations. But in return, I'm asking for an opportunity to help you on the list side. Okay. When you completely renovate the property, give me the opportunity to list the property, right? And if the investor says, I have no problem with that, I will give you the listing. I'll sign a listing agreement later. I says, cool, all right. So for the sake of transparency, Mr. Investor, what I like to do is I like to document that you're okay, that once you take possession and owner of this property, if it's your LLC or you as an entity, that we have something in writing that says you're going to give me the listing. Okay. So what you're going to do on the BRBC, right, is the buyer representation agreement is part of our practice now that has to be done with working with investors and working with traditional buyers. Now, the beautiful thing about working with an investors is that on the buyer representation agreement, it it allows you to extend that provision of 3 months. If you look at section A1, it says representation period, right? And that representation period says that beginning date and expiration ends at 11:59 p.m., right? But it also says that it cannot exceed 3 months unless the buyer is a corporation, LLC, or partnership as required under the California Civil Code. Representation period exceeds 3 months and buyer is not an entity, this agreement is void. Meaning, okay, this is a good thing, that if it is an investor, a flipper, has a corporation, an LLC, that they're going to be submitting offers, then it extends that buyer representation agreement. You can have a BRBC for 1 year or more, right? Now it has to be reasonable, right? But in essence, it's not locking you in for only 90 days, ladies and gentlemen. Okay. And I sincerely apologize that I'm going over my time. It is being recorded. So you can always go back to this video if you need to sign off. But the essence is that's the beautiful thing. That's the leverage and the power, right? You have more than, a 3-month period. With that being said, right, you identify, you find a property. You always want to make it exclusive, right? You always want to check that. Go through the elements of what you're doing in regards to the representation agreement. But where you're going to put the language is on other terms. Okay. Other terms. That's where you're going to put the language that says that per the agreement that you will provide me with a listing. Okay. And you can be specific, and I want you to be specific, because if you submit an offer on a specific property address and you know it's going to get accepted, then you want to make sure you reference the listing as, in reference to 123 ABC Street, that once you take possession of the property, meaning possession and ownership, that you will give me a 1-year listing. And at that point in time, we will execute a listing agreement. Put it on the BRBC. Because guess what? Who signs and initials this agreement? That's correct. The buyer signs this and you sign this. So that solidifies your position that you have documentation. Okay. They don't own the property yet, but as soon as they take possession, you have it in writing that they will sign a listing agreement. Well, what if they say they change of heart on that? And that can happen. Well, we'll explore those options at that later time, right? Then you can work out something else, but you can hold them accountable to it, right? And I would also stress and emphasize, just for matter of sake and argument, is that, price to be determined, but, the listing compensation shall be. Okay. Because once you put a specific amount, now you can negotiate if they are trying to back out of it because they realize, look, I thought we were going to be able to give you the listing, but unfortunately, after running numbers, properties in this area are not selling for the property price. Therefore, I have to go with someone else. Or are you willing to reduce your commission? Or are you okay to exit out of this, but we'll pay you a referral, right? Or we can challenge it, because we can go after compensation, because now, as long as they own the property and we have something in writing in the forefront, which is the BRBC, I believe we have an argument to go after compensation, even though they may not give you the opportunity to list, right? The intent and the goal is obviously, right, that they're going to give you the listing, right? That's a win, right? That's a win. But a lot of agents are not practicing, and they're not thinking outside the box and how to secure when working with flippers. This is how you do it with a buyer representation agreement. You're predicting and putting it in writing in the forefront of this conversation. One, you have a BRBC even before you even submit offers, right? So now they cannot use this as an excuse and argument saying, well, we talked about it, but I have a change of heart. Because the first thing you're going to do anytime you submit an offer on any property, you have to have a BRBC, because commission is now negotiable, right? You're going to submit an offer to the listing agent with the hope and the intent that the seller is going to pay you compensation. But what if they don't? then we hold the buyer accountable for them to pay you compensation. This is why you have to do your due diligence, folks, especially working with investors. Look at their financials, because if their financials are up to par, they can pay your commission, and it's perfectly legitimate to ask. Okay? Because what if they have a property that they want? It's a great property, but part of the stipulation is you're getting a discounted property, but also we're not going to pay the buyer agent compensation, and that may happen. I'm not going to lose the deal because they don't want to pay compensation. I'm going to ask the buyer, this is why you want to secure and solidify this agreement right from the very beginning, because now you hold the buyer accountable to your fee. Obviously, we want the seller to pay us, right? That credits the buyer's obligation to pay you compensation. But what if this is the deal breaker that we can go in without even asking for compensation on the listing side? The seller may see it as a win. Look, I'm netting more, even though I'm losing money, but the property's a junker, right? The property is in bad condition. I don't have the means to fix or renovate it to sell it for more. I want out of this. So they may see it as a win. And more so when you're not asking for compensation, or they're not willing to pay, at least the investor, what? Because usually investors have deep pockets. They're in it for the long haul. They've bought multiple properties. They can write you a check as well because they see it as a benefit. Okay. And that might be the hook that ultimately gives you the opportunity. But remember, the BRBC with the buyer, excuse me, with the purchase agreement needs to be together, right? This is how you secure a future listing when working with flippers, because you cannot sign the listing agreement and say, sign the BRBC, sign the purchase agreement, sign the listing agreement. Okay. If you were telling me that, I would say, I'll sign it, but doesn't hold water, because at the minute that we close, I can say I wasn't the owner of the property, so it's a void contract because it's going to have the address, the APN number. We can reference it right on the real list. I wasn't the owner on so and so date when we signed this agreement. That might be the loophole. Challenge me on that. I dare you. I'm going to win all day long. But when you put it on the BRBC, right, which this is a responsibility from you and also the buyer, and it has specific language of additional terms, then we can challenge that individual on the successful purchase, right, on the successful of transfer of ownership, because that's what we put. When they take ownership and possession of it, they will, allow the listing agreement to be executed, right? We can use that as ammunition and ultimately secure the listing. Okay. And we're hoping, right? We're hoping that all investors and flippers do the right thing, right? If you're gonna be working with them, it doesn't hurt to ask. Most investors will say, look, I would love to give it to you, but I already have a crew that already does the back end. Okay. And if the seller pays you this amount, I will give you an incentive, and I'll give you an additional 0.5% or 1%, just because we're not going to be able to give you on the back end. But because you brought us this opportunity, I'll pay you, a bonus for representing us on the purchase. Okay. And again, remember, the beautiful thing is the seller and the buyer can pay you too. Both can pay you as well, right? But the BRBC also has to reference that, right? So I always go with the BRBC and go with a big number, go with the 3% compensation, because most likely 3% that used to be the normal is not the normal now. It's usually two and a quarter, or 2.5%. So if it's 2%, well, then that offsets the buyer's obligation to pay you the difference of that 1%. So when you're ready to close the deal, 2% from the seller, 1% from the buyer, a 3% total commission that you're going to get on the front end of this transaction. Okay. or the buyer may be willing to give you additional means. Okay. They may be in agreement to that 1%, but they may be grateful too, because they're going to make a pretty decent profit. They may throw in an additional 0.5% into this transaction and give you not just 1, but 1.5 plus the 2, that's 3.5%. Okay, so that may be a win for you as well. Thoughts, questions, or concerns regarding that strategy? Okay. All right. Well, then that pretty much concludes today's session. I hope I was able to give you some understanding in working with flippers. Proactively ask a lot of questions, make sure that they're seasoned, experienced, that they know what they're doing. Ask for referrals. Tell me the properties you close, right? Because if it's a legitimate investor and they've closed deals, they can reference all the properties and can say, I've closed ABC Street, I've closed Freddy Cougar Street, I've closed Superman Street, right? And now you can go in there and reference and say, oh yeah, look, here's the corporation. And what else can you do to verify the corporation is you can go to the Secretary of State, California, and then type in the S Corp, C Corp, LLC, and sometimes you'll be able to see who is the actual representative of the corporation, right? And if it matches, then you know that it is the individual's corporation, right? With that.
I'm
So I
sorry,
hope that
Simon, where did you say to go for that?
you can go to the California Secretary of State Corporation. So you can, when you are referencing or you're trying to do a little bit of investigation when it comes to corporation, you can go to the state, and then it'll say search for corporations or LLC, and there you'll see who is the owner or representative of that corporation. So if it matches the individual you're having a conversation with, then you know that it is the corporation. If they are telling you, okay, if they're telling you that they've closed 5 transactions and they're providing you with these corporations, right? And I would question them, right? Okay, let's say it was 5 different corporations, but the name doesn't match. I would ask more questions. Well, tell me a little bit more about this one, because when doing my research, it doesn't identify that you are the owner of that corporation. Oh, well, that's my wife. Okay, so tell me a little bit more, right? Because again, anyone could say, I've closed X, Y, and Z, right? You know, you can take it for face value, but you can also do your due diligence and be proactive. Again, you don't want to waste time with individuals that don't have experience, because if they don't have the experience, it's going to be a nightmare. You know, one, they don't know what they're doing. They think they do, compared to individuals that do understand and close deals. You know, we want it to be a streamlined process, but we also want to make sure that you're working with individuals that know and understand the process, because in any investments and any individuals that are flippers, right, there's always going to be risk, right? And again, our job is just to navigate. It's not to know the complexity, but at least understand your position, because you don't want to go in escrow, fall out of escrow, and they're just wasting your time and making you submit offers left and right, and they're backing out because they're making excuses. Because one of the biggest things that I see with investors is they try to tie the property, okay? They have no intent, and you got to also be very careful for the individuals that are wholesalers. These are not individuals that want to buy the property. They just want to tie the property with the intent to find an end user. And now you're kind of stuck in the middle, and it may be challenging and very difficult, right? So again, asking the right questions and asking, hey, are you planning to buy this property, or are you planning to wholesale this property, right? Because what they'll do as wholesalers, right, they'll see a property, ask you to submit an offer, tie the property, and then now they have third-party websites that they're now promoting this property. Then you get a call from the listing agent, hey, I see that this property is being promoted by this individual here. What the heck is going on, right? And now you look like you're being exposed, and you didn't even know, right, that they're trying to wholesale it to someone else because they're trying to make a spread, and their intent was never to sell, or excuse me, never to buy the property, right? So you got to be very careful with these individuals, and there's a dime a dozen out there that say they are, but they really aren't, right? So if they use, third party proof of funds, right? Not your traditional, right? Like your Bank of America, your Wells Fargo, your Chase, or any institute, right? I would have that alert on as like, okay, whose money is this? This is obviously not your money, right? So those are kind of the engagements and the conversations you should be having with these individuals. Again, not to waste your time, right? Because you don't want to be stronged into a situation and dilemma, and now it opens up a can of worms. So just be mindful about all that and be cautious. So I hope that kind of
Hey
answers.
Simon,
Yes.
I'm sorry. Simon, so if they ask, like, if you ask if they was a wholesaler and like say they was like, oh, we're not gonna wholesale the property, and they end up wholesaling the property, and like, how would you navigate that situation?
I'm sorry, repeat the question one more time.
So if you ask them, like, are you wholesaling the property or are you legitimately buying the property? And they say, oh, we're not wholesaling it, and they end up wholesaling it, like like intentionally lied to you in your face. How would you navigate that?
Got it. Well, it's not really your position. It's ultimately the listing agent,
Okay.
because wholesaling is allowed. Okay, so
Okay.
let me go to the purchase agreement real quick. I'm going to show you where it says about wholesaling. Where you see assignment request right here, K. Do you see
Uh-huh.
it?
Yes.
Okay. So basically, if you go to paragraph 23, it says that it allows 17 days, right, after acceptance. But let's just go to paragraph 23 and see what 23 says, right? So you go to paragraph 23. And here it says assignment and nominations, right? Buyers shall have the right to assign all a buyer's interest in this agreement to buyer's own trust or to any wholly owned entity, a buyer that it is existing at the time of such assignment. Meaning, we can assign it to our own. So if I buy it as myself, as Simon Cazares, I have the right to assign it now to my corporation, my LLC, right? That is
Mhm.
permissible, okay? But what it says here, buyers shall not assign all or any part of the buyer's interest in this agreement without first having obtained a separate written consent of the seller to a specified assignee. So you cannot just, a wholesaler cannot just think that because they secure the property, right, that they can now sell it to Joe Smith, okay?
Mhm.
Because Joe Smith is a separate entity that is not your own trust, your
Mhm.
own S corp, C corp, or LLC. So that is not permissible. You have to get a written permission from the seller.
And that's
So
the
if this
assignment. That was the
individual,
assignment contract that they be giving out.
say again.
Is that the assignment agreement that they be like the wholesaler give the buyer, I mean the seller?
Well, yeah. I mean,
Okay.
again, you got to look at it from two faucets, right? The faucet is they're buying it with the intent of closing the deal. And if they
Mhm.
didn't tell you, and now you find out that they're wholesaling, that's a breach of contract, and the seller
Got
can
it.
now send a notice to perform, meaning, hey, you failed to do what you agreed to. And because of section 23, we're canceling. Well, what do you mean you're canceling? I thought I can assign it. Well, you can assign it to your own entity. But here's where the seller and the listing agent can cancel on you based on paragraph 23. We never got an approval by the seller. We didn't have any separate agreement that you're going to wholesale it to someone else. So, and this is where the issue that most listing agents and agents who represent buyers don't know. This is a cancellation provision that you can use because the buyer breached the contract. Remember, there's conditions to everything. This is like reading a story, right? The story of price, terms, and conditions. And when you navigate the purchase agreement, all of your questions and answers can be addressed based on this purchase agreement. And where a lot of agents fail is they don't interpret or they don't know how to execute these agreements because one, they don't know what's in it. They assume, but here in black and white, it says that it's not assignable to anyone other than the buyer's entities. So if I was the listing agent and you are representing the buyer and I find out that the buyer had no intent of buying this and was wholesaling it, put the property in a third-party website to try to find an end user, we locked it in at 500,000, but this idiot, pardon my language, buyer is trying to sell it for 550 because they want to make a $50,000 spread, right? That's a problem. And if I find out as a listing agent, I immediately going to let the seller know. The seller is going to say, nope, that's not what we agreed to. Let's go ahead and send the notice to perform, right? And the notice to perform is, allowing them to retract from trying to close it with someone else. And we're going to use the cancellation provision of 23 saying that the buyer breached the agreement based on this paragraph. Okay.
Got
So
it.
it's
Thank you.
unfortunate if you're in that position, but you don't really have two legs to stand if the buyer didn't truthfully tell you their intentions was never to buy the property. This is why, I would also, have that conversation with the buyer. Says, look, you put me in a very awkward position here. If your intent was never to buy, and I asked you, are you planning to buy and close it, or are you planning to wholesale it? Because then my conversations would have been different. I would have put provision in there to give you the upper advantage to be able to wholesale it if you needed to. But just to not tell me, and I find out through the listing agent that you or someone else put this on the open market, it's not acceptable. Then you have every right to counsel with this buyer and not work with them, right? Because they were not being honest. What else are they not being honest with you as well? You got to ask that question, right? Because you don't want to be in a liability. And I've seen situations where now it opens up a can of worms. There's litigation involved, and it's not a good position to be, right? When you're working with a buyer, because the buyer definitely breached the contract. So you have to look at it from that perspective. Those circumstances, bring it to our attention. We'll help you navigate and try to find a solution, right? And again, going back, it's just the full transparency of the situation. I hope that makes sense. Any
Yes,
other
it did.
questions
Thank you
before
so
we
much.
close out? You bet. All right, team. Well, that concludes, and I sincerely apologize that I went over my time, but I hope this information was of value. And again, if you have any additional questions or anything that I'm able to help address, bring it to my attention. I'll be more than happy to navigate it together. With that being said, have a wonderful and a safe weekend, and be careful out there in driving. It's
Amen.
raining and
Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. You have a
Thank
good
you.
day.
Have a nice
Thank
weekend.
you.
Bye.
bye-bye.
Thank you, Simon.